At the end of June, Reading told the FA that they weren't able to compete in the Championship next season after a takeover bid fell through at the final hurdle. In 2020, Reading were a top half WSL team and had reached the FA Cup semi-final the season before. Fast forward 4 years and they didn't have enough money to even begin a new Championship season. The Women's Football Board have accepted their application to re-enter the pyramid at the 5th tier, and on Tuesday they released 16 players. Today we're joined by Guardian journalist Tom Garry, who broke the news last month. Tom, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back to the pod.
Oh, pleasure to see you. Thanks for having me.
We've just been introduced to your lovely, lovely dog moments before we started recording. So a massive thank you to him for also joining us in the background. Tom, can you give us a little bit of an update on the latest situation with Reading?
Yeah, sadly now the painful reality now arrives because so many of the staff are now gradually being served with their redundancies across the football club, the women's side of the football club, which is the really awful sort of human aspect of this, that people are losing their jobs because of the cuts, these drastic cuts to take the setup from a championship operation to now being at a regional level in Tier 5. The club have announced open trials coming up for a team that won't have to pay subs, but certainly the inference from all of the information we're getting is that there'll be no salaries for those players who train a couple of times a week, and they're moving away from the main Reading training ground as well to a kind of third-party location. So the wider football club has had a bit more positive news in the past few days. Writers like my colleague Ben Fisher at The Guardian have reported that the takeover of Reading by former Wickham owner Rob Couig is edging much closer. And I get the impression from all I'm hearing that certainly that if that takeover goes through, that the women's programme and carrying on with a women's team is certainly something they're planning to do, because at one point there was a fear that even a Tier 5 operation might not be in the current ownership's plans. But yeah, in reality, this is a kind of a really dramatic fall off from a club that was loved by many fans, that had done great things in the women's game and had helped play a big part in the rise of the women's game over the last decade. So it's been an extremely sad summer for lots of people.
I was quite worried about Reading when they did finally get relegated. It did feel a bit like it was inevitable in terms of how the kind of last couple of years have been going in the WSL. And I had a real worry about how I just felt like once they dropped into the Championship, I wasn't sure they'd come back up again. I don't think I expected this kind of drastic drop. Maybe it's too big a question, but it does feel a bit like how much of this, there's many factors, I suppose, and I know things like as the game grows, the expectations on clubs, including Championship clubs, grows and grows, but also how much of this is down to mishandling at the club, I guess.
Well, I think from the people that I've spoken to internally, the feeling is it's very, very largely down to mishandling from the ownership, and that has applied to the men's team, of course, too, who have had various financial difficulties. They've had points deductions and huge fan dissatisfaction with the ownership, with Di Younger particularly, who throughout this process appears to have been missing in action. Even in the 48 hours prior to Reading withdrawing from the Championship, I believe there were very senior people at the football club desperately trying to get hold of the owner, just to get, some kind of communication, and it was really, unavailable. And I think that's so frustrating, that ownership, senior ownership at the football club, were not available, didn't really seem to be that interested. The cost cutting on the women's side has been happening for a while. Last summer they reverted to part-time, and that's sort of what you're alluding to there, H, isn't it? In that, everyone hoped that Reading might make a real fist of things in the Championship, but in reality, 12 months ago, this process was already beginning because they were going to part-time. And I know from speaking to a lot of the staff at Reading, they feel really proud of what they achieved last season, under the circumstances. And I think not only the senior side, one of the things that makes me most sad about this is the youth setup. Reading had a really thriving youth setup. They were one of their youth teams, won a senior cup last season, beating Milton Keynes' adult women's side, and they have now, in losing that, they've lost, I think, a generation of players from Berkshire who could have gone on to do great things for Reading, and will now be looking for other clubs. So, in talking about the bigger picture, I I think what was incredibly striking about this story was that 24 hours earlier, the press pack, or many of us, were at a very, very luxurious hotel in Mayfair where Michelle Kang was doing a press conference at London City Lionesses, sort of in one of the most expensive hotels in central London. And she was revealing Aslani and Jocelyn Plocher and kind of unveiling plans to try and win the WSL and invest in world-class facilities. And genuinely, about 20 hours later, Reading were having meetings with the staff, telling them that the team was dropping down 3 divisions and that they were, most of them were likely to lose their jobs. So that kind of contrast was extraordinary, and I think was, in a sad way, sort of a perfect encapsulation of the contrast in the Championship right now for the haves and the have-nots.
It always felt like Reading achieved in spite of what they had up against them. It was almost like they felt oftentimes they were up against their own club, and it was like behind the scenes they were just waiting for them to drop down, for that final brick to be pulled out so that they could be like, there we go, now we don't have to worry about the women's team anymore. I've always felt a bit like that. And we saw 16 players, as you said, released, which is just like, it's devastating. You were in the Championship, you were a Championship player, Chloe, for many years. What will they be going through right now, like emotionally, financially?
I think, disbelief, I think, is probably the first thing that everyone probably feels. Often these decisions are communicated really, really last minute. So I think it's probably a case that, the players wouldn't have had much time to prepare for it, wouldn't have probably been consulted, would probably be in the group WhatsApp, like the players always have like their own private WhatsApp chat. A lot of them will be in there trying to find comfort from each other and trying to ask each other what they should do. Maybe they should kind of, form together or, make a statement or a collective statement in some form. I think a lot of players would probably consider doing something like that. But I think it also puts you in a really vulnerable position because you kind of want to speak out on some of these issues, but you also, on the other side of things, know that you have to then find another club. And I think there's sometimes that fear that if you start speaking out and making trouble, as some people might say, that will affect your chances of maybe trying to find another contract elsewhere. So I think that's probably in the back of their minds as well, and especially for some of the younger players who are kind of, looking for opportunities to kind of stay in and around the Championship with the, potential to get into the WSL. A lot of clubs have already had their eyes on people, in the months leading up to the transfer window, trying to get into clubs at that stage. It's very difficult, but I think overall, like from a personal level, it's that frustration and the sadness that something like this that can happen to you years and years, and the main club hasn't kind of stepped up and, just put in place measures to stop this kind of thing happening. We saw something similar not too long ago with Coventry. I mean, this week for women's football generally has been quite a poor one with everything that's gone on with Man United. So I think it's also a stark reminder to the rest of, I suppose, the women's football community that whilst we're headed in the right direction, we're getting audiences, there's more eyes in the games, we're getting bums on seats, the commercial direction, we're seeing greater transfer fees and things like that. Actually, we're still in a really vulnerable space in the Championship, definitely more so than any other, the Championship and the National League are still so fragile to anything that the main club do because the finances just aren't there. But it'll be interesting, actually, I think, Tom, and what you were saying about the London City Lionesses comparison, because they are essentially a bit of a template of how clubs could potentially run in future independently with the right, genuine, authentic type of investor who isn't, so dead set on trying to find a quick return on investment and actually wants to see a club grow in a completely different model than we've seen before that's not been tied or affiliated to a men's club. So I'm really hoping that the London City Lionesses sort of prove what can happen outside of the main club framework. So, yeah, please, girls, bring it some success, because I think it could operate as a bit of a template for other clubs. But yeah, it's been a really difficult time for the players.
Yeah. Speaking of investors and US investors, Tom, there was an attempt, right? There was some US investors interested in taking over the women's team, and it seemed to just fall through at the last moment.
As we understand it, there was an approach from a consortium to try and save the Reading women's team. We wrote an initial story in June reporting that Reading, could drop out of the Championship because of a lack of financial guarantees for the following season, and shortly off the back of that, there was an approach from a UK investor with American investors as well as part of a consortium, and they were proposing to buy the women's team for a token amount but fund it going forward, several £100,000 per season to kind of keep it in the Championship, and that would have kept the team afloat. And as I understand it, Reading were quite happy to go ahead with that. That was all in place, and because of that The FA granted Reading's women's side an extension for a week to give them more time to decide whether or not they were going to apply for the Championship, and that extension gave them a deadline of the 30th of June. But when the takeover fell through, that meant that Reading then, did not apply for the Championship and applied to go down to Tier 5. I believe that takeover fell through because the ultimate ownership of Reading's men's side weren't willing to sign off on it because of conversations they were having with prospective investors for the football club. At least one of those didn't want to lose the women's team from within the company. That's our understanding. So because of that, the deal to save Reading, the deal that was there that could have kept this team going, just collapsed it right at the last minute. And as soon as that then fell through, then the football club said that they were not able to apply for the Championship. And I think that was quite frustrating for people involved in the club, because and for the FA, right, because they felt that there was somebody there who was willing to fund it. But it should never have really come to that in the first place. This was all very last minute, and I think the frustrating thing for some of the fans and the staff and the players is that there is, even though Reading are in financial difficulties, there is money in the club and in this level of football to fund a women's team at Championship status. And I've trawled through Reading's accounts and on Company's House. Even 2 years ago, they paid the highest paid director at the football club over £500,000 for their salary. You only have to look at what's published. Small examples like the agency fee, the fees that to intermediaries paid by League One clubs are all published every season. And last year, Reading spent about £300,000 on agents' fees. Actually, that's not very high for the League One, so they're not the highest payers in that sense, but I'm just giving a few examples of that there is cash available, and we often see this, don't we, that whenever a team is cutting back, sadly, the women's arm of a football club is where they decide they think they can save money, and that's been so depressing over the last decade. We've seen it with Notts County, we've seen other examples where teams have dropped down leagues, Yeovil, for example, and it's such a shame that when people are running short of money, they think that the first thing they could save on is by not providing women the same opportunities, and that's been one of the most depressing things about this whole saga.
What do you think this kind of tells us all about the state of the Championship ecosystem right now? Because I think for me it feels just very fragile. I mean, you've mentioned a couple of examples there, and kind of another one of those recent examples. Catherine Batty broke the story about Blackburn plan to pay their first team players £9,000 a year for the upcoming season, with the players on 16-hour contracts receiving the bare minimum wage. I mean, what does all this say about kind of where we're at, really?
Yeah, it's a very fascinating but complex moment for the Championship, with it, with the new co arriving as well, and the Blackburn example, which was great reporting from Catherine, and interesting as well that the club have not denied the story at all. The Blackburn story is an interesting point relevant to Reading because, for those who don't know, when Reading made their public statement about dropping down to Tier 5, one of the things they claimed was that the licence criteria for the Championship was rising to a point where they would have to invest more and go full-time. But my understanding is that's not quite right. And certainly the Blackburn story, where you have a team paying players to play on contracts for 16 hours a week, that's certainly not consistent with Reading's claim that they were going to have to go back to full time. Those two things can't both be true. So I think some of the clubs' claims that the criteria for the Championship is getting too demanding clearly can't be right if you've got clubs getting away with 16 hours a week. So there's a bit of PR from different sides going on there, but certainly the Blackburn story and other clubs, and what Reading got away with last year in terms of the funding is a real worry for me about the Championship. And I think it comes down to the fact that the revenue streams for the league are at the moment not very high. But my frustration, looking as a more wider point, is that there is money in this sport to support two divisions of full-time women's football. Going back to the agents' fees, the Premier League, it's public knowledge that the Premier League clubs, men's Premier League clubs, collectively spent £400 million on agents' fees last season alone. Forgive me, I'm not trying to just attack agents. Many of them are lovely people, but that's an enormous amount of money, relative to the amount that is being spent on the women's game in this country. I think that's more money than the women's Super League sides have spent on their women's programmes collectively since the WSL began. So we're talking about there's so much money in our sport, and it's I'm not trying to pin the blame on kind of overspending on agents specifically. That's just an example, but I find the idea of people saying there isn't enough money to give women's teams, say, £600,000 a year to run, a championship club in a healthy way and be mid-table. I find that quite exasperating because there is enough money in the sport.
I think what's interesting you say there about the amount of money that's just floating around the game, and it's just kind of a stark reminder that a lot of times women's football relies on the whims of someone who thinks that it looks good to invest in a women's team, right? And I think that's such a dangerous place to be in, because, as you've touched on, when things go wrong, the first thing that gets cut is the women's game. And I've just come back from America, where you're looking at people investing in clubs. They have no connection to men's teams. This is seen as a solid business opportunity, a long-term investment. Angel City has just become one of the most valuable clubs in the world at something like 250 million or something like that. It is viable, it is doable, but I feel like the relationship with sport over here and the I guess the real belief in women's sport over here seems to be in a very different place, which is just incredibly frustrating. I mean, I feel like we could talk for hours on this and vent our collective frustrations, but in terms of Reading themselves, this week, as you said, they announced they're accepting first team trial applications as they attempt to rebuild to their, I put in unfortunate comments, former strength. How long is the road ahead for the club? What happens next?
Well, it really depends on whether the takeover of Reading's mains club goes through, which people are now expecting it to do so in the coming weeks, and then it really depends on their ambition. If it is, as we expect, Rob Couhig, the former Wickham owner, it really depends on his ambition for the women's side, and certainly, I think. I did not a huge amount of optimism, because one of the options, I suppose, over the last few months has been for one of the people trying to buy the men's club to say, I'll come forward right now and help out with the women's team. And for whatever reason, that hasn't happened. So I think the Reading fans, I don't want to give them false hope that they're going to kind of win promotion after promotion and rise back through the leagues very, very quickly. But I think we will see a regional team sort of slowly try to sort of rebuild and provide community level football. And I think that's it's going to be a completely brand new team. It's going to be a brand new set of players, and they've lost so many good players as well. And I think we talked about the 16 players leaving. There were 6 loan players who left as well, so kind of 22 departures, and that's a decimation of a very good side. What they will now face will be sort of opponents who are predominantly playing at what people might perceive to be kind of slightly higher than grassroots level. We're talking about teams where players are working in normal jobs and training a couple of evenings a week. So they're not going to be the only brand down there. That we know that there are big men's Premier League clubs like Brentford playing in Tier 6, for example. Fulham have got a women's side in Tier 5, which is the same tier that Reading will be at. But it's certainly a very far cry from the Championship, and I think it could. We've seen how long it took even clubs with vision and investment like Southampton. It still took them several years because of the bottleneck in the pyramid, because only one team goes up and one team goes down. You can often find it takes you much longer than you want to win promotion up through the pyramid. So even if the new owners of Reading display great ambition, we could still be looking at least 6-7 years before we see them back as a real force in the women's game, and there's a huge number of ifs to cross before we get there.
It's heartbreaking. They will always have a very special place in my heart, Reading.
And for good reason, because this is a club who have helped produce icons of the English women's game, Fran Kirby, Mary Earps, and a club that was, for many, I think, a real symbol of defiance that it wasn't. They were helping to delay the takeover of the giant brands. They were 4th in the WSL just 5 years ago, Women's FA Cup semi-finalists, and I think for many people it was quite refreshing that it was, there was a different name up there that wasn't just the so-called Big Six from the men's side, and they, along with Birmingham and a few others, helped to sort of delay what has now happened, which is that all 12 WSL teams next season are affiliated to a men's Premier League side, and for the first time. So for those people who liked the idea that the women's game was a bit different to men's football, maybe people who are nostalgic about watching Donny Bells win titles and compete for trophies, that sadly, those days are over and in the past. So if that was something that you enjoyed about the women's game for being refreshing, that this is not welcome news at all.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that, Tom. I really, really appreciate your insights, and I think, from everyone here at Upfront, and obviously from yourself, Tom, we're absolutely devastated to hear about what's been happening and sending our thoughts to those players and staff affected. But yeah, I mean, for what you were saying, Tom, there is some hope, and we do hope that things do improve with the situation with the club. But thank you so much for joining us, Tom. Really appreciate your insights on the situation.